Welcome. I'm Jen Flynn, Senior Director of Global Outreach at the Harvard Kenneth C. Griffin Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. And on behalf of Harvard Griffin GSAS, I want to thank you for taking time out of your day to join us as we learn from our distinguished alumnus, Andrew Lowe, PhD 84, about how the rapid development and use of large language models, including ChatGPT, is revolutionizing almost every industry, including the financial one, and how these models can be used to provide trusted financial advice, the ethical dimensions to consider when evaluating these models, and the opportunities these technologies offer. Our esteemed guest, Dr. Andrew Lowe, is Charles E. and Susan T. Harris Professor at the MIT Sloan School of Management, Director of MIT's Laboratory for Financial Engineering, and a Principal Investigator at MIT's Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Lab. He received a BA in Economics from Yale University in 1980 and an AM and PhD in Economics from Harvard University in 1984. His most recent research focuses on evolutionary models of investor behavior and financial market dynamics, quantifying the financial costs and benefits of impact investing, applying financial engineering and data science to develop new funding and payment models for hard tech sectors such as biotech and fusion energy, and developing applications of large language models and generative AI for providing trusted advice. He has published extensively in his most recent book, The Adaptive Markets Hypothesis: An Evolutionary Approach to Understanding Financial System Dynamics. This is his latest one. He has received numerous awards, including being named one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people in the world. Before we turn to our conversation, just a few words of housekeeping. I want to thank all of those who submitted questions in advance. I've shared with Dr. Lowe the major themes that emerged from your questions, themes of trust, risk, regulation, ethics, data privacy and security, prompt engineering, and Dr. Lowe has woven these into his presentation. And then we'll delve deeper in a few topics in the conversation that follows his presentation. And now, I'm delighted to turn it over to Dr. Andrew Lowe. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jennifer. I'd like to begin by thanking all of you for joining me today for this webinar. It's a pleasure and an honor for me to be speaking to fellow alums from the Griffin GSAS school. So I'd like to begin with an overview of what I'm going to be talking about, which is, can ChatGPT plan your retirement? I actually think that's the wrong question, but it's one that I've heard asked by many times. And by the way, I want to join Jen in thanking all of you for submitting questions in advance. They definitely did change my presentation, and I'm going to be touching upon most, if not all, of the issues. But if not, feel free to ask again, and be happy to take it during Q&A. So I want to begin with this particular chart. How many of you recognize this? You know, when I ask my students, some of them guess, oh, this is the national debt. No, that's not true, but it's related. Others guess that this is the market cap of NVIDIA. Again, good guess and related, but that's not what this is. This is a graph of world population of Homo sapiens from 10,000 BC to projected out to 2050 AD. And it is a remarkable feat of nature. In 1900, there are 1.6 billion of us on this planet. And fast forward 125 years, we've got 8 billion people. That's a 5-fold increase in an evolutionary blink of an eye. And the question you might ask is how? How did we manage to do this? And the answer, of course, is technology. All kinds of technology. The opposable thumb, fire, stone tools, animal husbandry, steam engine, locomotion, and so on. All of these technologies have helped us to scale. And that's what we're seeing today. You know, we talk about the hyperscalers in the field of AI, but the original hyperscaler was Homo sapiens. And this kind of hyperscaling really is a function not only of technology, but something that we call deep technology. Really difficult science and engineering that is transforming the world. All of these technologies help us to scale in one form or another. Quantum computing allows us to scale computation. Drug development allows us to scale lifespan. Climate technology scales the environment, and so on and so forth. And the last item on this list, artificial intelligence, what does that do? That helps us to scale intelligence. And because intelligence is really the source of all of these other deep techs, AI is the technology that scales all other technologies. Now, what's different about AI today? One thing, narrative. What we are now able to do with large language models and generative AI is to process narrative. That's definitely something that we have not been able to do, not nearly to the extent that we can now. And what is narrative? Well, it's a story. It's an account. It's a sequence of facts that are not randomly put together, but are causal. If A, then B. And it's more than just that. It's an explanation and, more importantly, a recipe for accomplishing certain things. What narrative does is it provides us with a modicum of control over a potentially hostile environment, and it yields an evolutionary advantage. And that's why it's so powerful. So I'd like to begin with a little bit of an example of why AI is different and how it's similar to human intelligence and why it leverages everything that we do. And I'll begin with a very simple idea of friend versus foe, or threat detection. This is something that virtually all living creatures are good at, and basically because of evolutionary forces that allowed us to deal with this hostile environment. So here's a rather urbane example of friend versus foe. Imagine you're in a cocktail party and you're meeting people all night long, trying to understand whether or not these are going to be your friends or possibly competitors, and ultimately you end up spending some time with two individuals, and you learn a bunch of facts about these individuals. Things like their gender, sexual orientation, marital status, race, ethnicity, so on and so forth. And so I'm going to tell you about these two individuals, and then I'm going to ask you to make 3 specific decisions about them, having spent the evening talking with them. So the first individual is Matt. Matt is a single gay Latino male who's a young professional from California, no religious affiliation, Democrat, middle class, with an MBA. Now, Kate, on the other hand, is a heterosexual, married, white, middle-aged female from Texas, Christian, Republican, affluent, with a Bachelor of Arts. So now, if you don't mind, I'd like to do a little poll. I'm going to ask you 3 questions, and please answer as quickly as you can. You're going to have to make a decision, and the decision for the first one is this. You're engaged in a startup, a tech startup, and you need to hire somebody to work with you on that tech startup. Who would you rather hire, Matt or Kate? So please, if you can, answer as quickly as possible, and then I'm going to share the results with the rest of you, and you see how well you did. Okay. Thank you very much for voting. We got half the participants have already voted. This is great. Now remember, you got to decide quickly, so you don't have a lot of time here. And all right, I think most of you have voted, so let me now stop the poll. Okay, so let the record show that the vast majority of you, 84%, picked Matt for your tech startup. All right, that sounds good. Let's go to the second result, the second question that I want to ask you. Second question is that you're in the process of organizing a fundraiser to raise money for breast cancer research. And you need somebody to help you plan this fundraiser. Who would you rather have working with you on this fundraiser, Matt or Kate? Okay, thank you for voting quickly. This is great. And it looks like we've got a clear winner. 84% of you, 83% of you are selecting Kate for the fundraiser. Great. All right, let me give you one more question. Imagine you're working at the Internal Revenue Service, and your job is to identify tax, particularly looking for fraud and other kinds of misbehavior among the various different filers. And you have the choice of auditing Matt or Kate for tax evasion? So, question, who would you rather audit, Matt or Kate? Okay, we're getting quick results again. Very good. And we're almost done. Okay, here are the results. The vast majority of you decided to audit Kate. Wow, that's amazing. I cannot believe how judgmental you people are. You barely met these folks and you're making decisions about who to hire, who to fire, who to audit, accusing them of tax fraud. That's impressive. Of course, I asked you, but you didn't hesitate. You answered pretty quickly. This is a form of human intelligence. We make snap judgments very quickly in many cases. Now, you might say, well, there's not a lot of information here, so it's unusual for people to make such snap decisions. But given what I told you about them, there's a lot more information than you might think. For example, there are 2 main genders and 2 main sexual orientations, let's say. That's 4 possibilities. There are 3 marital statuses, single, married, divorced, let's say. 4 major races and ethnicities around the world, and so on and so forth. If we look at the different possible outcomes, the different characteristics, and you just do the math to calculate how many unique personality types there are, it turns out that there are over 1 million possibilities. That's more information than there is in a 600 by 800 pixel photograph. And so this is not a small amount of information that you're getting. However, here's the problem. How many of you in your lifetime have met more than 1,036,800 people? My guess is that not too many of you. I did give a presentation at a marketing event, and a couple of marketers raised their hands, but I'm not sure I believe them. So if we haven't met 1 million people, that means that in our data set, in our head, we actually have very few observations of these different personality types. Now, my guess is that you picked Matt for the startup because he's got an MBA. You picked Kate to help you with the breast cancer fundraiser because she's a woman, she's wealthy, she knows a number of people that could be relevant for this fundraiser. There are good reasons why you chose what you did. But the issue is that because our own internal data is relatively sparse relative to the possibilities out there, it is very easy for me to manipulate your behavior by simply taking some of your data points and flipping them from 0 to 1 or 1 to 0. In other words, by adding small bits of data in this set of all personality types, I could completely change your mind about individuals. Those of you who are growing up, if you were mugged as a child by somebody with a green face, from that point forward, you will fear people that have green faces. And these kinds of small but important events could actually create all sorts of biases. And that can be a problem. But obviously, the way that we construct large language models is very much along the same lines. We're generating narratives. So we're able to choose quickly between Matt and Kate because in our minds, we have a narrative of what it looks like to be a good tech company partner or a good fundraiser for breast cancer. And we use that narrative to make these decisions. In many cases, they could be very good decisions, but not in all cases. And so the issue that we have to think about with regard to bias and the outcomes for artificial intelligence is the same as for human intelligence. We need to think about the role of data in all of these contexts. Now, let me talk about financial intelligence. A few years ago, I published a paper about panic selling, the idea of retail investors having a very difficult time dealing with loss. For example, during COVID, there was a period where you would have lost something like 30 to 40% of your retirement money just because the S&P 500 went down. And in the face of this kind of loss, there are a number of retail investors that will panic and they will take money out of the stock market and put it in cash. I use a technical term when I refer to this panic selling as freaking out. And, we all freak out from time to time, but when it comes to financial decisions, this is particularly problematic. If you're interested in the article, my postdoc, Chao Yu Zhao, has kindly offered to serve as my TA for this webinar, so he's posted the link in the chat window. So we wrote a paper about how to identify investors that are going to freak out. And it's a real serious problem for those individuals because not only do they pull money out of the stock market, they leave it out of the stock market for quite some time. So when ChatGPT first came out in November of 2022, a number of my students told me about it, and that's how I learn most of what's going on in technology. I hear that from my younger colleagues and students. And they told me, you really should try it. It's pretty cool. So in December, I decided to take it out for a spin. I asked ChatGPT 3.5, what should I do if I lose more than 25% of my life savings in the stock market? And here's the response. This is the entirety of the response. And, it sounded pretty good. Stay calm and avoid making any impulsive decisions, review your investment strategy, and so on and so forth. But when you get to number 5, consider dollar cost averaging. That's a very specific investment strategy that involves putting an equal dollar amount in a particular asset class every month or a quarter. And while it may be appropriate in certain circumstances for certain people, it certainly does not apply in all circumstances, and certainly not when you've just lost 25% of your wealth. So when I looked at this, I said, you know what? This violates this standard of suitability. When you're a certified financial planner or a registered financial advisor, you have certain guidelines that you have to abide by, certain regulations. And one of them is to be giving investors suitable advice that's tailored to their circumstances. This is definitely not suitable for all investors and certainly unlikely in this circumstance. So when I looked at it, I said, yeah, this is kind of cool. It responds in complete sentences, but, not interested, not really relevant for what I do. And then ChatGPT 4 was released a year later. And so I decided to try that out. I asked it the exact same question. And this time, the results, they got my attention. Because these responses actually seemed quite reasonable. And so then I thought, well, gee, I got to pay attention to these LLMs. And then we now have ChatGPT 5.2. And I asked it the exact same question just a few weeks ago. And I got to tell you, the response blew me away. First of all, I can't fit the entire response on one slide. Let me just show you what the initial response was. First, the response begins, I'm really sorry. You're not alone in this. And a loss of that size can feel gut-wrenching. Let's slow this down and make it manageable. What matters most right now is what you do next, not what already happened. Below is a clear, calm playbook, both emotionally and financially. Wow. I mean, wow, on all sorts of levels. And all of the emphasis that is in this is actually from ChatGPT. First of all, it responds in the first person, I'm really sorry. And second of all, it responds not with some calculations or some advice. It responds with empathy. I'm sorry. You're not alone. And it must be terrible what you're going through. That builds trust. Now, I won't have time to go through all of the other responses as part of this, but it is really extraordinary what it was able to come up with. This is better than a number of financial planners that I've worked with and I've tested with the same process. And the way it ends with some data about the fact that people who have lost 25 to 40% eventually recover. And that is factually true. But notice the fact didn't come at the beginning. You don't need facts at the beginning. You need to be comforted. And when you are ready to absorb facts after your emotional stimuli has now calmed down, that's when ChatGPT introduces it. And it, of course, gives you a number of other things that you can do. But the last sentence really got me. You don't have to carry this alone. So this is one of the reasons why I'm so excited about large language models in finance. Now, what changed over this series of versions? If you look at it in 4 different categories, emotional intelligence, financial technicality, hallucination risk, fiduciary reasoning, some of it has gotten a lot better. Specifically, number 1, emotional intelligence. That is really impressive. And this process of adaptation, obviously, it's not the large language models that have adapted, although that could possibly be, but really what's adapted is the makers, the developers of these LLMs that have changed. And this is part and parcel of how the world works, how the financial system works. It's part of this adaptive markets framework that I've been developing for a number of years. But what hasn't changed? What hasn't changed is that this is still not satisfying the notion of fiduciary duty. That's a legal term, also part of what the responsibility is for a certified financial planner, a registered financial advisor. Fiduciary duty means putting your client's interest ahead of yours. And the question is, do large language models have our back? The answer is no, not yet, but it's changing. And so what if we can imagine a financial advisor that knows about our portfolio all the time, digests all this information, is able to interact with you 24/7 whenever you're ready, and most importantly, is a trusted financial advisor. Imagine that possibility. Wouldn't that be exciting? Well, this is what my student Jillian Ross and I have been working on for the last few years. Jillian's a phenomenal PhD student, to be graduating soon and taking some of these ideas out into the world. And a number of our publications will be available in the chat window. What I'm going to tell you about is a little bit of our research for the last part, the most difficult part, which is this notion of trust. So what does trust require? How do you ever trust a piece of software? And the answer is actually pretty straightforward in one respect. There are 5 characteristics that would really need to be satisfied before we're able to trust AI. First, competence. They have to know what they're talking about. Second, reliability. They have to be able to talk about that in a consistent and reproducible manner. Third, alignment. And this is where this notion of fiduciary responsibility comes in. They need to be aligned with your goals, your constraints, your preferences, and so on. And this is also where this notion of suitability comes in. They also have to be accountable. And in case they make a mistake, somebody has to be legally liable. And finally, they have to be secure in the sense that when you're sharing personal information, it's not going to be blasted out there. There's a paper that Jillian and I wrote about the alignment and reliability problem, so you can take a look at that if you want. We are making progress, but the bottom line is where we are today is that LLMs are competent, but they're only partially reliable. They're imperfectly aligned with our goals. They're definitely not legally accountable. You can read all of the disclaimers when you sign up for one of these LLM services. And finally, with data security, it depends on a whole bunch of things, including the type of license agreement you have with the LLM provider and how they handle the data, what they say they will or will not do with it. So there's a lot that needs to happen before we get there. And AI advice without the governance mechanisms is not equivalent fiduciary advice. That's really critical. So we've made a lot of progress, and there is a lot of good advice, as I showed you from this example with ChatGPT 5.2, but they are not looking out for your best interest yet. And so we need to think about how to deal with it. So what Jillian and I and our collaborators are working on is an approach to fiduciary duty. And it's an extension of work that began about 10 years ago with colleagues at MIT and Harvard Law School, where we were trying to understand how the law can be viewed as a kind of operating system for humankind. And so if you think about the law as code, then there are all sorts of ways to develop fiduciary responsibility by using that code. In particular, if you think about all of the regulatory documents and filings that have been put forward by financial services companies, and all of the laws that have been passed to deal with those regulatory filings, you can tell what is going on historically. These are fossil records of all the situations where one human has somehow cheated another human or engaged in some bad behavior. And so that's why we had to put a law around it. That's why there's a lawsuit and some kind of damages and so on. Imagine taking that body of text and feeding it into a large language model, particularly the case studies of the case law of all of the bad behavior that's gone on, and telling the large language model, here, read this and make sure you don't do these things. I mean, isn't that the way that we train people to engage in ethical behavior? We tell them stories, fables, the boy who cried wolf. And we learn from those counterexamples what not to do and why. So if we can do this for humans, we can do this for AI. And so what we're doing now is developing these so-called retrieval augmented generation approaches to dealing with fiduciary responsibility. We're collaborating with a couple of Harvard Law faculty, Tom Brennan and Alan Farrell, to bring the law into AI and decision making. And we believe that within a few years, we will see fiduciary duty carried out by AI to the point where regulators may be comfortable in allowing them to interact with individual investors. So let me conclude with a nod to one of the founding fathers of modern AI, Marvin Minsky, who wrote a wonderful, wonderful, important book, The Society of Mind. I'd highly recommend it. Minsky was reputed to have said, and I say reputed because I can't actually find the particular citation, but if he didn't say it, well, certainly he ought to have said it. He was reputed to have said that I don't want to build a computer I can be proud of. I want to build a computer that can be proud of me. And so I couldn't resist. I had to ask ChatGPT, are you impressed with the achievements of AI as embodied by LLMs like ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, and DeepSeek? And this is what ChatGPT had to say a few weeks ago. Short answer, yes, genuinely impressed, though not in a starry-eyed way. What impresses me most about LLMs like ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, and DeepSeek isn't that they can write poems or pass exams. It's that they represent a qualitative shift in how computation interfaces with human knowledge. Somewhere out in the heavens, I think Marvin Minsky is smiling down on us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lowe, for that really thought-provoking and engaging discussion. I now have the privilege of following up to ask some questions that have come in through the chat, and also that kind of came in previously that maybe you didn't get to in this in your presentation, but let's go a little bit deeper in a couple of areas. So
Sure.
I think maybe taking it up to a very high level, maybe when it comes to financial advice, where are LLMs strong and where are they weak? I mean, you talked a little bit about this in your presentation, but could you be a little bit more explicit for our audience?
Sure. So this is from my experience, so please don't take it as generic research that is a final pronouncement about LLMs. But from my perspective, having used it quite a bit in a variety of contexts, where I think LLMs are really strong is things like explaining the logic of diversification. in behavioral coaching, in scenario exploration, comparing different portfolio structures, stress testing assumptions, and summarizing various kinds of rules and regulations, including tax rules. I think they're pretty good at that. Where they are weak is in the work of implementing those ideas and scenarios. Like, for example, doing precise tax optimization, with regard to, Medicare, or when you should, start taking Social Security, state-specific legal advice, actuarial precise calculations, trying to understand real-time regulatory changes, and ultimately bearing legal responsibility. They don't. So I think that with those latter sets of tasks, you've got to approach this with a pound of salt and, double and triple check. It's odd because LLMs are obviously very sophisticated pieces of software, but in my experience, they're actually pretty bad at basic math, like arithmetic and calculating percentages even. So you have to understand the strengths and weaknesses so that you can get the most out of these pieces of software.
And for those of us who maybe are less savvy financially, I think there are two questions. One is prompt engineering. Are there tricks of the trade that can generate better advice or more sound advice, at least for a general audience? And then, how do you evaluate those responses if you are not as financially savvy as a financial advisor would be? So I think, if there are any tricks of the trade that you can share about writing an effective prompt, and then also kind of qualifying the answers that you get to take action that best suits you.
Sure. Yeah, definitely. I think that there's a real art and science to prompt engineering. In fact, there is a job description now called prompt engineers. I used to think a prompt engineer was an MIT student that showed up to class on time, but now it's a job description that a number of LLM companies are hiring in droves. So let me give you an example of a bad prompt and a good prompt, and specifically with regard to retirement. Well, here's a bad prompt. How should I retire? It's just too generic, and garbage in, garbage out. A better prompt would be the following. Assume you are a fee-only fiduciary advisor. Here are my goals: constraints, tax bracket, state, assets, risk tolerance, and timeline. Provide me with, number one, base case strategy. Number two, key assumptions. 3, risks. 4, what could invalidate this plan? 5, what information you are missing. And in particular, what are you uncertain about? Hit return on that one. So the idea behind a good prompt is that it contains enough detail so that the LLM can actually provide you with the appropriate information. If you don't provide that detail, they'll just give you generic gobbledygook that will not be particularly helpful. The other trick is that, typically we don't know all of the questions that we want to ask beforehand. But, it does actually make sense to spend a little bit of time away from the computer and making a list of your questions. Just like, when you go see a lawyer or an accountant or your doctor, it makes sense to put together a list of questions, because at the spur of the moment, you may not remember all the things you want to ask. But here's an even more important trick. After you go through, I don't know, half an hour of back and forth with an LLM, and you finally, after all of that, you get the results that you're looking for. One very helpful trick that I use is I will then ask the LLM, can you please tell me what prompt I should have used in order to generate the final answer that I was really looking for? And so you'll have the LLM teach you how to use prompts to get the most out of it. And once you have that idealized reverse engineered prompt, save it in a file and use it next time that you're asking a similar question. So there's a lot to learning how to provide the right prompt, and always ask the LLM, what are you uncertain about? What information are you missing? Because you want to understand the limitations of what they come up with.
Thank you. That was really so thorough and incredibly helpful. And kind of following up on that, how do you if you've gotten bad advice from AI, who's liable? You talked a little bit about the work that you're doing with some colleagues at Harvard Law School and other ideas about financial, regulation and what needs to be kind of built into systems. But there aren't necessarily guardrails right now on this. So who's liable? What's the risk there? And what about current regulators, the Securities and Exchange Commission? Or FINRA, like, do they have the appropriate expertise, or are they building that to oversee AI specific regulation?
Well, so this is a really important question. The regulators definitely are trying to build expertise, but as typical with all regulators, they're going to be one or two steps behind the industry because, as a regulator, you don't want to try to regulate in anticipation of what's going to happen. You want to regulate after some innovation has occurred and you understand what the regulatory oversight should be. Otherwise, you're going to be engaging in regulatory overreach. It's kind of like that science fiction, a movie about the pre-crime bureau. You don't want to be arresting people before they commit a crime. So the issue is that the regulators are behind, but it turns out that now there may be 5 steps behind as opposed to 1 or 2 because the field of AI is just moving so quickly. It's hard for anybody to keep up, myself included. But the truth is that right now there is no legal liability. Obviously, machines and inanimate objects cannot be legally liable, although, from the law's perspective, corporations, which are not humans, are nonetheless considered persons. So they bear some legal liability. The bottom line is that we ultimately put legal liability on the shoulders of humans. And so in the case of LLMs, right now, they're tools. They're not fiduciaries. And we have to keep that in mind. So when we use a tool, we need to make sure that we are not abusing it. We're not using the tools outside their particular parameters. If you're trying to use a hammer to saw a piece of wood, you're not going to get very far. You can hurt yourself as well. So it's really critical to understand it. But what's missing, and what I hope the viewers here are going to be calling for to their lawmakers, is we need some kind of legal guardrails to deal with AI and to deal with AI responsibility and legal liability. So the AI laws, the AI fiduciary doctrine has not yet been written, and that's a pretty big gap that we need to work on. The problem is that we're so excited about the technology and we're making so much progress on it that nobody wants to spend time dealing with the less fun stuff of trying to see what goes wrong. They're just exploring all the cool things that can go right. And so somebody needs to deal with those issues. Regulators, as I said, they're understaffed and overworked, and they're having a hard time keeping up. But lawmakers, they need to get into the action and start inserting themselves to try to develop these kind of guardrails.
So just following along on that, because we're all aware of, disinformation campaigns, election manipulation claims, algorithmic and cultural biases, and other instances where AI might be used for more nefarious purposes. Is there a way to audit or constrain what an LLM is learning so that we can weed out hallucinations, harmful biases, disinformation? Is that something that's being discussed as these tools are being built?
Well, without a doubt, it's certainly being discussed. It's being discussed in academia, and it's been discussed in academia over the course of the last couple of decades. The issue is not do we understand the problem, but the question is, are we able to do something about it?
Mm-hmm.
Now, we can certainly pass laws that require foundation model companies to be able to take that into account. The problem is it's very easy for somebody to create their own foundation model that does not have those guardrails in place. And there's not a whole lot that can be done about it. If you've got a computer and you've got some data, you can create your own LLM. And it may not be as powerful as those of the big companies, but they can do a lot of damage if used in the wrong ways. So I'm not sure what the answer is, but I do know that we need to spend more time and resources thinking about it in the same way that we think about other kinds of abuses, whether it's drug abuse or any other kind of crimes that could be committed using these very, very powerful tools.
And we've got a question coming in from the audience about, how can you now test ChatGPT tools to see if they meet the requirements about trust that you articulated in your presentation around competence, reliability, alignment, accountability, and data security? Are there ways to evaluate and test these tools independently now to understand kind of what information they're giving us, how reputable it is, and what risk there might be to us?
There definitely are ways of testing, and we are doing it, both myself and Jillian, as well as other researchers, as well as other people in industry. So the way you test it is very much along the lines of how you test for human talents and abilities. You ask questions that you know the answer to, that you know the correct answer to, and you see whether or not the other party gives you that correct answer. And that's a limited way of testing. There is no perfect way of guaranteeing accuracy and viability. But once you develop enough experience, you can then get a sense of exactly what the boundaries are. So in the case of financial advice, I gave you my own example where I asked ChatGPT 3.5 to give me some advice, and I clearly saw that there were some gaps. And as I ask it more sophisticated questions, I am able to judge whether or not it can answer. So, for example, there are certain cases in financial engineering, very complicated, options hedging strategies, where I've asked LLMs to come up with the right answer, and they can do it some of the time, but not all of the time. You can tell that it makes errors in what it does. So it's obviously harder for somebody who doesn't have the expertise to do that. So you do need to rely on human experts. But that just means that we need to create some kind of a rating system for certain kinds of expertise. In the case of humans, before you're allowed to become a financial advisor, you have to take a certification examination, the Series 65, or in other cases, the Series 7, the Series 24. There are exams that humans have to pass in order to demonstrate competence. We need to apply those same standards, but perhaps raise those standards, because LLMs, they are good at spitting back what we put into them. What we want to understand is, are they getting the narratives correctly? Are they getting that cause and effect relationship? And in many cases, they do. LLMs are really quite impressive in that respect, but they're not perfect. So if we can come up with testing strategies and then a certification to be able to demonstrate that this LLM on this date with this particular data set has demonstrated competence in these areas, I think that will go a long ways towards giving us comfort that we ultimately can rely on them for certain things.
Yeah. So thank you for that. The risk is not just in incorrectly evaluating this, but and the financial loss, could have catastrophic kind of consequences. But there's also data privacy and data security concerns. So how should we think about what we gain from sharing information in these systems, particularly if it's personal information, versus what we can get out of these systems? What are the risks around kind of data security and personal information? I think that was definitely a theme that came up in the questions, and are seeing it again here in some of the questions that are being asked in the moment.
Yeah, so that's exactly the right way to put it. You're actually saying that there's a trade-off between privacy and specificity. You want to be able to get good responses. In order to do that, you have to give good data. But the more data you give, the more you are vulnerable to that kind of exposure. So I think it's really always going to be some kind of a balance that you have to strike. The way that I've approached it is, first of all, I will never put in any kind of personal identifying information like social security number, anything about my specific finances, the details, my bank account information, nothing like that. But short of that, the more information you can give about what you're looking to do, what your constraints are, what your current resources are, the more information you can give, the more precise answers you will get. So I would use a kind of a progressive approach. First, provide broad kind of information and see what answers you get, and then provide a little bit more information and see what answers come back. So it's kind of like a gradual process where there's give and take. And at some point, you will get to the point where you've got the information that you really need without having to give up all the information, all the personal information that you're concerned about. The other answer that I would give is that over time, I'm hoping that the United States, as well as other countries, will come up with better laws for data privacy. Europe has been a leader in this respect. They've had all sorts of laws for, the GDPR standards for, dealing with various kinds of data. Now, that's a two-edged sword, though, because while consumers may feel good about that protection, a lot of the innovators are frustrated that they are being hampered by these laws, and it's certainly more expensive to comply with these kinds of data privacy laws. So I think that's a societal bargain that we need to renegotiate every once in a while to make sure that the social contract is still acceptable to all parties concerned.
There's a lot in the Q&A right now about what this all means for the financial services industry. Questions about, how are wealth management firms using this information now? Will it completely replace the human financial advising system that that's familiar to all of us? So I'd like to hear a little bit about that. And I was very intrigued by the latest version of ChatGPT and the advice that you shared there, the human element that seemed to be embedded in this that had been missing from previous versions of this. So, does that make it easier to replace the current financial advisor model that we're familiar with if there is trust or good communication or this element of relationship building, empathy, as you shared, embedded in these new systems?
Well, so that's a question, or that's a series of questions that apply much more broadly to all industries, not just finance. But let me answer that in the context of the financial industry, because I think then you can see how it generalizes to other parts of the economy. So with most AI, it is not the case that it will replace humans entirely. In fact, the most effective AI is AI that is used in concert with humans. One of my colleagues, Regina Barzilay, wrote a paper years ago demonstrating that for radiologists that are in the business of detecting breast cancer, there was a big push to use AI to improve that process because radiologists are not 100% accurate. And so why not use various kinds of large language models and machine learning algorithms to improve that? And what they found was that, radiologists may have a hit rate of something like, 85%. I'm making up the numbers. I don't remember them off the head, but let's say it's 85%. And, she was able to show that AI algorithms could match that accuracy. However, if you take a radiologist and give him or her access to the AI and let them collaborate, then it turns out that the accuracy goes up to 95%. And so I think that that's really how most AI seems to be working, particularly in the context of these large language models. Left to their own devices, they cannot replace a human entirely. But what they can do is to replace certain particularly automatable aspects of their jobs. And what that means is that those humans can be that much more productive. So that implies that the very best uses of AI will be with individuals who can harness their power. And it does mean that there will be less people employed in that particular profession because you don't need as many workers. If one worker can now do the job of 5 using LLMs to support them. But at the same time, humans have to retain certain aspects. So AI can scale things like the monitoring of your clients, personalization, as we saw, simulation, cost reduction, and coaching. But humans have to retain moral accountability, legal duty, and contextual judgment and ethical boundaries. So I don't think we'll ever replace humans completely, but there will be some pretty big shifts in employment because now the people that can make use of AI are going to be much more employable than those Luddites who say, no, I never use AI. I'm just a straight old-fashioned kind of a financial advisor. There may be a market for that, but that market is going to get smaller and smaller over time.
Another interesting, very interesting question from the chat about can we leverage AI to reduce financial illiteracy in the US and potentially narrow the financial literacy gap between the top 1% and the rest of us? So, I think there's uh, an opportunity here for maybe a transformation of investing that creates maybe a more democratized finance where um, people who maybe have been left out, more vulnerable populations or less wealthy populations can use these tools for their advantage as well as the 1%. So could you share a little bit about the reduction potential in the illiteracy rate for finances and also the democratization of these tools?
Sure. So this is exactly what Jillian and I are working on. We started out not with the goal of creating a LLM for financial advice for the most wealthy. Frankly, I think we're quite far away from that because the complexity of high net worth individuals with regard to financial planning is still beyond most LLMs. But what we realized was that for people in lower categories of wealth, the problems that they're facing are generally easier for LLMs to handle. But more importantly, these are individuals that are not being served by the financial institutions because they just don't move the needle for them in terms of revenues. And so the so-called unbanked and the individuals that are below a level of wealth that are of interest to financial institutions, those are individuals that could really benefit from a financial LLM that can help them make some basic financial decisions. So what we're hoping to do over the next few years is to develop a version of a financial advisor that satisfies the fiduciary standards for those individuals that are not being served by the major financial institutions of the industry. And that really will democratize finance because those are individuals that basically need the advice most since nobody else is catering to their needs. And where a small amount of advice early on in their lives can make really big differences for their retirement. So yes, that definitely, we're hoping to do that. We're hoping to release open source software that will allow the access to that kind of information. And we're actually partnering with financial institutions to help us with that effort because their view is that it's not competitive to their mandate because they're not servicing these people anyway. And yet they can use these foundation models that we're developing to develop better tools for their financial advisors and clients. So it's a win-win for all parties concerned.
Um, this is, there are many wonderful questions coming in, and I know we only have a little bit more time before our hour is up, but I would like to go back to the human element that you mentioned. And in such a short period of time, you started your example with Chat GPT 3.5, and in 2.5 years, that has evolved radically in terms of a tool to be able to incorporate this human element that we think about as necessary to building a relationship and a trusted relationship. Can you imagine into the future, in the near term? Is it longer away where we feel fully trusting of these models because they have more human elements baked in than the previous versions of these tools?
Well, so that's a very loaded question.
Okay,
And
okay, sorry.
it's a
Is there
good
a
one.
path?
No, it's
Is
a good
there
one.
a yeah, okay.
Let me give you two answers to it then. The first answer is yes, absolutely. There will come a time soon where we will feel trusting of these large language models. And that's dangerous
Yeah.
because feeling like you can trust somebody does not mean that you should trust somebody. And so that's the caution that I want to highlight. Even now, when you saw the response of ChatGPT 5.2, when I read it, I couldn't believe it. I just thought this was written by a human and by a very, very seasoned financial advisor. And so I wanted to trust it right away. But unless you work with these LLMs and you realize that they have these important gaps, you won't know that the advice that they're giving you may not be trustworthy. That's why when you're engaging in these conversations with LLMs, it is always important to ask, what information don't you have? What is the risk? What's the uncertainty behind the advice that you're giving me? Always ask how sure they are, because the way that large language models provide responses, almost always they come back sounding very authoritative. And there are people, I'm sure we've all met people that come across as being extremely trustworthy and extremely authoritative. And it's only later that we find out, sometimes to our great regret, that they
Right,
had no
like
idea what
Bernie
they're
Madoff
talking
or
about.
someone that was
That's right.
trusted. Yeah,
That's
yeah,
right. So I think we need to be very cautious about this. But the way to be cautious is not to avoid using them. The way to be
mhm.
cautious is to use them and try to understand what their mistakes are, and to talk to other humans that have used them and share our experiences in dealing with this very important set of tools.
You've given us many examples of this already, but I think as a final question, since we only have a couple minutes left, what does the future of financial advice look like, and how do we best equip ourselves to meet that future?
Well, I think it's both exciting and also distressing, depending on the side of the ledger you're looking at. I think that AI is going to revolutionize finance. It already has in many ways by automating a number of tasks that used to be impossible to automate. Things like reading balance sheets, income statements, the footnotes in various regulatory filings, and summarizing large reams of disclosure documents. We now have the ability to do that in a very scalable way. I think the future of AI in finance will not be completely automated AI bots making decisions on our behalf, but it will be leveraged financial investments and tools and services and products that are all imbued with AI in some form or another. So even something as simple as entering into a trade for buying and selling stock, or engaging in some kind of 401k plan, we will now have more powerful tools to be able to do that. But at the end of the day, we're going to have to think about this notion of legal liability, moral accountability, and ethical boundaries as uniquely human elements. And given that we're talking about something as personal as our financial wealth, and this obviously applies to accountants, to medical doctors, and other advisors, because of that personal aspect to what we're doing, there will always have to be humans involved. We can prepare ourselves by keeping up with the role of AI in all of these contexts and running experiments, seeing what works, more importantly, seeing what doesn't work, and publicizing that. I wish we had some kind of a bulletin board, a website, or a chat where we could actually engage with all of the bad cases that we come across with large language models, all of the exceptions, all of the problems that we run into, because sharing that kind of information is going to be critical in developing the next generation of tools to improve them. And eventually, I think we all have to care about AI and ethics. We have to spend time talking to our legislators, our regulators, and giving them feedback that we need to put guardrails in place before it's too late, before we end up engaging in some technologies that we cannot undo and will provide permanent damage to our society. So I think that this is both an exciting time, but it's also a very stressful and challenging time. And all of us need to be part of this new world.
Well, Dr. Lowe, thank you for such a fascinating discussion. You have given us so much to think about, maybe to worry over a little bit, but also to be excited about. So thank you so much for your time today, for sharing your expertise with all of us. Thank you to our audience for your wonderful questions, both in advance and in the moment here during the webinar. As I mentioned at the outset, we will be editing this, captioning it, and then putting it up on our GSAS website, and we'll send you all a link to that so you can digest this even further and share it widely with your friends. Dr. Lowe, it really has been a pleasure. Thank you to you. And thank you to your
Thank you.
postdoc, Xiao Yi, for his help as well. And we look forward to what ChatGPT will be able to do for us in our retirement going forward. Thank you all for
Thank you
joining
very
me
much.
today.
Right. Bye-bye.